In the cavernous hearing room on Capitol Hill, the seats meant for Republican lawmakers sat conspicuously empty, glaring back at the emotional crowd like a stage set where absent actors should have been, as victims of violent encounters with immigration and customs enforcement, part of a stringent federal immigration crackdown under Donald Trump's administration, stepped forward one by one to bear witness to moments that had upended their lives, recounting in visceral detail the shuddering impact of being shot at, losing loved ones, or narrowly escaping death, all while Republican members who could have stood with them remained noticeably absent, a silence so loaded with political implication that the room seemed to vibrate with tension long before the first testimony began. What started as a forum organized by Democratic senators and representatives to shed light on stories of pain, survival, loss, and unresolved grief quickly became a dramatic tableau of conflict between the lived realities of U.S. citizens harmed during aggressive immigration enforcement operations and the broader political calculus that has defined the nation's immigration debate, illustrating in real time how power, policy, and personal consequence can collide with breathtaking force. Witness after witness took the microphone. Family members of Renee Good, a 37-year-old mother killed by a federal agent in Minneapolis, brothers speaking with trembling voices about loss that had reshaped every corner of their lives, and survivors recounting the moment bullets tore through what should have been a routine encounter. Each word echoing off the walls as cameras whirred and live streams carried their testimonies into living rooms across America. The emotional weight of these moments was impossible to ignore. Here were ordinary people, nurses, mothers, children's guardians, describing violence that had forever altered their sense of safety, and yet not a single Republican elected official was present to witness these stories firsthand, a fact that added another layer of raw tension to an already charged atmosphere. Commentary in political circles was swift. Some Republican figures quietly expressed concern privately about the way ICE operations were being carried out and the political fallout that would inevitably ripple into midterm elections, urging thorough investigation and proper oversight. But this private acknowledgement never translated into physical presence at the hearing, leaving constituents and critics alike to wonder whether political calculation had overridden moral obligation at a moment when empathy and accountability seemed most needed. As Democratic lawmakers looked on, voices cracked with emotion and pleas for justice floated through the room like a collective heartbeat. Calls for reforms in training standards, accountability mechanisms, and federal transparency that sought to honor not only the testimonies of those present, but the memory of those who would never again speak for themselves, laying bare a broader national reckoning with the limits of power, the consequences of enforcement tactics, and the human cost that often gets buried beneath partisan talking points. Meanwhile, the conspicuous absence of Republicans, legislators whose party largely supported the administration's hardline immigration agenda, became an unspoken testament to political division, a stark visual metaphor that highlighted how deeply polarized the current era of American governance has become, where the presence or absence of a lawmaker at a hearing can become as powerful a statement as the testimonies themselves, shaping narratives and influencing public perception long after the cameras were switched off. In this charged convergence of human tragedy and political theater, the room held more than just voices. It held the unfiltered reality of lives forever changed, the raw tension of absence and presence, and a dramatic portrait of how personal stories can both confront and outpace the broader machinery of power, setting the stage for intense debate, calls for accountability, and a deeply engaged public eager to see how this moment would ripple outward into future policy, votes, and the national conscience. As the testimonies continued, the room transformed into something far beyond a formal political forum, becoming instead a living archive of grief, courage, and unresolved pain, where every pause in a speaker's voice felt heavier than words themselves, and every tear that fell seemed to carry the weight of an entire community's suffering. One survivor described the split second when flashing lights turned into chaos, when shouting officers and drawn weapons created a storm of fear, and when gunfire erupted in what was supposed to be a controlled enforcement operation, leaving behind shattered glass, shattered trust, and a permanent scar that no legal settlement or public apology could ever fully erase. Families spoke of how everyday routines, picking up children from school, returning home from work, walking down familiar streets, had become reminders of violence rather than comfort, how trauma followed them into sleep and shadowed them in daylight, and how their belief in protection from government authorities had been replaced with anxiety and uncertainty. A psychological toll that experts later explained often mirrors that of war survivors, revealing the deeper consequences of aggressive enforcement strategies that extend far beyond the moment of confrontation. Democratic lawmakers listened with solemn expressions, some visibly shaken, others gripping papers tightly, as though trying to anchor themselves against the emotional tide sweeping through the room, interjecting only to ask clarifying questions that allowed victims to fully express their experiences, while emphasizing that the hearing was not about attacking law enforcement broadly, but about examining policies and leadership choices that may have encouraged riskier, more confrontational tactics, particularly during the height of Trump's push for visible, forceful immigration crackdowns designed to send a message of deterrence at any cost. The phrase Trump encouraged hung in the air like a lightning bolt, not shouted, but implied through references to speeches, executive orders, and public rhetoric that repeatedly framed immigration as an invasion requiring strength, speed, and zero tolerance, a narrative that critics argue created pressure on federal agents to act aggressively, sometimes without adequate safeguards, training, or accountability, transforming enforcement into a performance of toughness rather than a measured application of law, with tragic consequences now being laid bare before the nation. Political analysts watching the hearing noted how the emotional power of firsthand testimony often reshapes public discourse more effectively than statistics or policy briefs ever could, because stories humanize what can otherwise feel like abstract debates. And in this case, the absence of Republican lawmakers allowed the narrative to become even sharper, creating a visual and symbolic contrast between those demanding accountability and those perceived, fairly or not, as avoiding uncomfortable truths that challenge their party's long-standing stance on immigration enforcement. Behind the scenes, media producers scrambled to capture every moment, knowing that clips of trembling voices and raw emotion would dominate evening news segments and social media feeds, while commentators prepared to debate whether this hearing marked a turning point in the national conversation or would fade into yet another partisan flashpoint, consumed quickly by the relentless pace of modern news cycles. Yet the intensity in the room suggested that something deeper was unfolding, a moment that could not easily be dismissed or forgotten. As the session moved forward, one truth became increasingly clear. This was not simply about individual incidents, but about a broader reckoning with how leadership tone, policy pressure, and enforcement culture intersect, shaping behavior on the ground in ways that can either protect lives or endanger them. And the testimonies served as a haunting reminder that political rhetoric does not exist in a vacuum. It travels through institutions, influences decisions, and ultimately lands in real neighborhoods, real homes, and real bodies where the consequences are felt forever. As news of the hearing spread across television screens and social platforms, the absence of Republican lawmakers quickly became one of the most talked about elements of the day, transforming empty chairs into a powerful symbol of political division, with commentators replaying wide shots of the room and asking a question that echoed across the country. Why did those who championed the toughest immigration policies choose not to witness the human cost of those very policies firsthand? And what did that silence reveal about accountability in an era where rhetoric often outweighs responsibility? Conservative voices attempted to reframe the narrative, arguing that the hearing itself was politically motivated, designed to generate emotional headlines rather than policy solutions, while progressive leaders countered that emotion was precisely the point, because behind every enforcement statistic stood families torn apart and lives permanently altered, and that refusing to engage with these realities only deepened public mistrust and prolonged systemic problems that demanded urgent reform rather than ideological defense. Meanwhile, social media platforms erupted with viral clips of testimony, particularly moments when survivors struggled to finish sentences through tears, or when family members held photographs of loved ones lost during ICE operations, images that resonated deeply with millions and fueled hashtags calling for investigations, reform, and greater oversight, proving once again that in the digital age, raw human emotion often becomes the most powerful force in shaping national conversations. Political strategists quietly acknowledged that the optics were damaging, especially for lawmakers in swing districts where voters were increasingly weary of extreme positions and longed for leadership that balanced enforcement with humanity, noting that while hardline rhetoric energized certain bases, Moments like this hearing exposed vulnerabilities that opponents could leverage in upcoming elections, painting a picture of indifference towards suffering that could shift undecided voters. Journalists covering the story began connecting the dots between past speeches, encouraging aggressive enforcement, policy memos pushing faster deportations and increased raids, and the environment those directives created for agents on the ground, where speed and toughness sometimes overshadowed caution and de-escalation, raising critical questions about whether leadership bears indirect responsibility for the outcomes of such a culture, even when specific incidents fall within complex legal frameworks. Inside Washington, pressure mounted for formal investigations into training procedures, use of force protocols, and accountability systems within ICE as lawmakers demanded transparency and independent reviews, while advocacy groups organized protests and vigils honoring victims, turning personal tragedies into collective calls for justice that reverberated through city streets and legislative halls alike. By the end of the day, it was clear that the hearing had evolved beyond a single event into a flashpoint moment, one that forced the nation to confront the intersection of policy, rhetoric, and real-world consequence, revealing how leadership choices ripple outward in ways that cannot always be controlled, and how silence, especially from those in power, can speak just as loudly as words, shaping public perception and historical memory in profound ways. Behind closed doors in congressional offices and news studios, conversations turned intense as lawmakers, aides, and analysts weighed the consequences of what had just unfolded, with some admitting that the emotional force of the testimonies had pierced through even the thickest layers of political armor, while others worried about how quickly the narrative was slipping out of their control, evolving from a policy debate into a moral reckoning that framed immigration enforcement not as a question of borders alone, but as a human rights issue with faces, names, and lifelong scars. Former law enforcement officials were brought onto television panels to explain how pressure from leadership can subtly reshape behavior on the ground, describing how constant demands for results, arrests, and visible action often create environments where caution takes a back seat to urgency and where agents feel compelled to escalate situations rather than de-escalate them, especially when rhetoric from the top rewards toughness and speed over restraint, a dynamic that many said had intensified during the Trump administration's aggressive immigration push. Victims' advocates seized this moment, amplifying stories shared at the hearing and connecting them to broader patterns of excessive force, lack of accountability, and minimal transparency within federal enforcement agencies, arguing that what the nation was witnessing was not a series of isolated incidents, but the predictable outcome of a system driven by political messaging that framed immigrants as threats rather than human beings deserving of dignity and due process. Republican leaders, still absent from the hearing itself, issued carefully worded statements expressing sympathy for victims while stopping short of acknowledging any connection between policy direction and the violence described, a balancing act designed to avoid alienating their base while minimizing political fallout. Yet critics pointed out that words without presence or action rang hollow, especially when contrasted with the raw emotion of families who had traveled long distances simply to be heard. The contrast between polished press releases and trembling voices on the witness stand became one of the most powerful elements of the story, reinforcing the perception of a widening gap between political leadership and lived reality and fueling public frustration with what many saw as a system more concerned with optics than accountability, more focused on winning ideological battles than protecting human lives. As night fell and the news cycle replayed the most emotional moments again and again, viewers across the country found themselves grappling with difficult questions about responsibility, power, and the unseen consequences of political rhetoric, with many expressing in comments and forums that the hearing had forced them to reconsider previously held beliefs about immigration enforcement, illustrating how personal stories can penetrate even the most polarized environments. What emerged from this chapter of the saga was a growing realization that the issue was no longer confined to party lines or abstract debates, but had become a deeply personal national conversation about safety, justice, and leadership, one that would not easily fade away, and one that promised to reshape the political landscape as pressure continued to build for meaningful reform and genuine accountability. As the hearing reverberated through media outlets, communities across the country began to mobilize, with rallies, vigils, and online campaigns highlighting the human cost of aggressive immigration enforcement and demanding accountability from both federal agencies and the elected officials who had long championed zero-tolerance policies without ever confronting the consequences firsthand, a public response that underscored the widening gap between policymakers and those affected by their directives. Legal experts began parsing the implications of the testimonies, noting that while individual cases may face challenges in court, the accumulation of evidence, emotional testimony, and documented patterns of force could strengthen civil suits and increase pressure on oversight bodies to examine enforcement protocols, internal investigations, and even potential breaches of constitutional protections, creating a scenario where political decisions could intersect with tangible legal ramifications in ways previously unseen. Political analysts emphasized that the absence of Republican lawmakers at the hearing would likely be scrutinized for years to come, with opponents framing it as symbolic of a broader unwillingness to confront the human consequences of their policies, while supporters argued it was a calculated avoidance of political theater, highlighting the tension between perception and intent and how symbolism often carries as much weight in public consciousness as policy itself. Meanwhile, survivors and families of victims leveraged their stories to appeal directly to the public, publishing videos, op-eds, and social media threads that humanized statistics and policy discussions, ensuring that the emotional resonance of the hearing would continue to reverberate long after official coverage ended, demonstrating the enduring power of firsthand narrative in shaping national debate and influencing legislative priorities. Behind the scenes, Democratic lawmakers strategized about next steps, considering legislation that would increase transparency in ICE operations, introduce stricter oversight mechanisms, and establish independent review boards for use of force incidents, while also weighing the political calculus of continued public hearings that kept the spotlight on the human stories at the center of the issue, reinforcing their messaging that policy must serve people rather than ideology alone. Media outlets continued to analyze every nuance of the testimonies, contrasting the emotional impact of absent Republicans with the presence of engaged lawmakers, producing stories that framed the hearing as a historic moment of accountability and pushing the narrative that the human consequences of leadership rhetoric and policy decisions can no longer be ignored. A framing that energized activist communities and created a broader dialogue about the responsibilities of those in power. By the close of this phase, it was evident that the hearing had catalyzed both legal and cultural momentum, transforming a single congressional session into a flashpoint for discussion about morality, responsibility, and the human cost of policy, while also emphasizing that leadership is measured not only in decisions made, but in the courage to witness and respond to the consequences of those decisions. A lesson that would echo far beyond the walls of the hearing room. What emerged from this chapter of the saga was a growing realization that the issue was no longer confined to party lines or abstract debates, but had become a deeply personal national conversation about safety, justice, and leadership. One that would not easily fade away, and one that promised to reshape the political landscape as pressure continued to build for meaningful reform and genuine accountability. As the final testimonies concluded, the weight of the absent Republicans hung in the room like a shadow, a silent but undeniable statement that amplified the voices of those who had been directly affected, turning their personal tragedies into a national reckoning, and forcing the country to confront not just the actions of federal agents, but the broader environment that had made those actions possible, one shaped by rhetoric, policy, and the tacit approval of political leaders who chose not to bear witness. Survivors left the hearing with a mixture of relief and lingering grief, knowing that their stories had been told, but uncertain whether justice would follow, while families of victims felt a bittersweet validation, having shared the memories of lost loved ones with lawmakers, journalists, and the public, yet acutely aware that symbolic acknowledgement could never undo the permanent harm inflicted, highlighting the tension between visibility, accountability, and the enduring consequences of government-sanctioned force. In political circles, the absence of Republican lawmakers became a focal point for discussion, debate, and criticism, both from constituents and national media, raising questions about the responsibility of elected officials to engage directly with the human cost of policies they support, and the moral weight of being present in spaces where lives and narratives intersect with legislation, rhetoric, and enforcement culture. Advocacy groups seized the opportunity to push for reform, highlighting the hearing as evidence that transparency, oversight, and meaningful change were not just political slogans, but urgent necessities, and that leadership must involve not only crafting policy, but witnessing, understanding, and mitigating the consequences of those policies in real time, especially when lives are at stake. The media narrative evolved from simple coverage to a broader conversation about accountability, morality, and the role of public service, emphasizing that power carries responsibility and that inaction or absence can be as telling as action, shaping public perception and influencing the broader societal debate on human rights, immigration enforcement, and the intersection of policy with lived reality. For viewers, the hearing offered a cinematic, emotional journey, the humanizing of statistics, the raw emotion of firsthand testimony, and the stark contrast between presence and absence served as a mirror for the nation, reflecting a moment in history where courage, vulnerability, and the consequences of leadership collided in a way that demanded attention, reflection, and response. By the end of this chapter, it was clear that the hearing had become more than a political event. It was a moral narrative, a living document of human consequence and accountability, one that challenged viewers to confront the realities behind headlines, the gaps between rhetoric and responsibility, and the urgent need for leadership that recognizes the human faces behind every policy decision, leaving audiences not only informed but deeply engaged, compelled to discuss, comment, and share their own reflections on justice, empathy, and the enduring power of bearing witness. What emerged from this chapter of the saga was a growing realization that the issue was no longer confined to party lines or abstract debates, but had become a deeply personal national conversation about safety, justice, and leadership, one that would not easily fade away, and one that promised to reshape the political landscape as pressure continued to build for meaningful reform and genuine accountability.